Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm George Hammond, chair of the Humanities Forum, which organized today's event. Today we have Kenneth Walsh coming back. For those of you who watched the video from 4 years ago, he was our first speaker after the pandemic started, the first one that we went Zoom on. And as he mentioned, very surprisingly, we got 18,000 views the first week, something like that. Everybody was obviously at home doing nothing. So we're going to cover a fascinating topic tonight. The architects of toxic politics in America. And it's interesting because it's not just 2 or 3 people. Exactly. It goes all the way back, and there's a lot of different functions of how it was done, and Ken does a great job of putting it all together. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And if you have questions and everything, we'll do live questions at the end. So maybe in 45, 50 minutes, something like that. So. Welcome back, Ken.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back again. I always like audiences here, particularly at the Commonwealth Club, because we tend to generate light rather than generate heat, which is very, very good for a speaker such as myself. So I'm really always happy to be at an audience like this.
Now, we were just talking about the history of in the room back there, the history of journalism, and Ken was at U.S. News and Report for 30 years, 40 years?
35 years.
Yeah, as the White House correspondent. So he was right in the middle of all those politicians the whole time.
Yes, exactly. It's not over, but I'm still doing a lot of journalism, but I'm teaching as well. Yeah. But I'm one of the fortunate people who's been able to do what he wanted to in his career, so I've always been grateful for that.
And so now you decided, obviously, after the last book, which, for those of you who don't remember, the last book, which came out right as the pandemic was beginning, was Presidential Leadership in Crises, from FDR to Trump. I mean, how could you have a better title than that, right at that time? So after that period of time, you came up with this idea. So yes. Why did you decide to focus on the people who, I mean, a lot of politicians are toxic. Yeah. But there's the architects, the ones who were so good at it that it yes. drove us in a certain direction, and that's who you focus on, which was great. I did. So how did you come up with this idea?
Well, as covering the White House as long as I have, I'm always looking for different ways to see the presidency and to see the presidents, and not just through the filters we have every day, a news conference or an issue of the moment. And I've done that in a number of my books, Presidents in Crisis, Presidential Isolation, even Air Force One, all of which I've written books about. But it has struck me so much in recent years how toxic our politics have become. I was brought up in the era of journalism, excuse me, where we were educators. We thought of ourselves as educators, not entertainers, not partisans, not people seeking power or influence. And it was a rather high-minded view. I wish more of my colleagues had it today, but we don't. We're much more into the entertainment function and, as I say, power, a way to get entree to power, a way to get famous, a way to make money even. And so I felt like there's something fundamentally wrong with our political system, and I trace it back a lot of times to this toxic politics. What I learned in particular in writing this book is how we've had this with us almost from the beginning of the country. George Washington was elected twice unanimously by the Electoral College. We've never had that since, and we never will have it again. Immediately after he decided not to run, establishing the precedent of 2 terms, which lasted until Franklin Roosevelt, by the way. He was elected to 4 terms. And now there's a constitutional requirement, only 2 terms. But as soon as Washington left the scene, we descended immediately into toxic politics. The election of 1796, Adams versus Jefferson. The election of 1800, Adams versus Jefferson again. Adams wins the first one, Jefferson wins the second. A lot of historians think that was the most toxic election we've ever had. The things that they called each other in those days, I mean, Jefferson's people called Adams a hermaphrodite. That's a word we could use today, but it's not a very flattering thing. They calling each other atheists and bringing the guillotine from the French Revolution, arresting people, one thing after another. And it went on and on. And so then after the election of 1800, Jefferson took office, and then we had what they call the era of good feelings. This toxicity started to wane. But it always comes back. The other point I want to make about that early time, another thing we think today about all these sort of character assassins in our politics with people who find the dirt about politicians and so on. The first character assassin was a guy named James Callender, who was a supporter of Thomas Jefferson, and after Jefferson won, Callender wanted to get a special job, postmaster of Richmond, Virginia. He didn't get it because Jefferson thought he was too negative. So Callender turned against Jefferson, and he broke the story as a pamphleteer of Jefferson having an affair with Sally Hemings, one of his enslaved women at Monticello, his plantation. It turned out he was right. Now we have DNA evidence that Jefferson did have an affair with Sally Hemings and did have children with her. Now, Callender was a terrible racist, and that's accurately depicted in history. But even something like that, the character assassination, it goes back very far in our history, and I could go on with many, many examples. But it just struck me how we've had this in our history. Why is it so bad today? One reason is social media. It amplifies everything. And my daughter is in the audience here today. She's a public official in Oakland. And we were just talking about this whole premise about what social media does. And what it does, you can find support for any view you have whatsoever. You can find it within seconds on social media. And you don't have to get any other information. If you just want to find that, you can live in that bubble. You can just live in that world, and you won't have your views ever challenged. You won't find alternative views. So it's the idea of seeking the truth is sort of completely secondary to our voters and our whole political system today in many, many ways. Just as a quick example of how this manifests itself in my life, I do a lot of speeches these days. And for a while during Obama's presidency, I would give speeches. This is actually on cruise ships, so it's a very high-end group. Mm-hmm. And a lot of them are very conservative. And I get 4 cruises in a row, I got the same question exactly the same way. Why do you people in Washington and the media not do the biggest story in the country? Okay, I said during the public Q&A. What would that story be? The questioners, all 4 of them in a row, the successive cruises said, well, we all know that Michelle Obama is a man. That's exactly the way it happened. 4 times in a row. So things were getting so crazy and so hostile. And I would say, after getting these questions, I said, well, where did you hear that? And the people would say, I don't know where I heard it, but I believe it. I saw it on social media. I saw it somewhere. That faded. It's back again. I just did a speech 2 months ago, I got exactly the same question asked in exactly the same way. So something very strange is still going on out there. Why do you not reveal that Michelle Obama is a man? So it goes on and on.
You know, there's 2 parts to that are amazing. One, that they think she's a man. But the other thing is why that would be the biggest story even if it was true. You know,
That's right.
That can't be the biggest story even if it's true. Let's go back to James Callender. I think that was a very interesting story because it was like Jefferson used him as his attack dog and then thought and then once he won, he didn't want to use him anymore.
Right.
And so then the attack dog bit him.
Yes.
And there are a lot of examples of that where you hire an attack dog and then they end up biting you. But that doesn't seem to dissuade anybody from using them.
No. Well, no, that's true. And there's so many threads leading to today. You talk about the attack dogs leading you. I must say that Donald Trump has been bitten by his own attack dogs. Mm-hmm. You see in the case of the hush money case, his lawyer Cohen was a key guy who testified against him. And Cohen was a tremendous attack dog for Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. Then he turned against Trump. A lot of his lawyers, this one lawyer who is now talking about how Biden has nothing to do with this case, the hush money case, just went on TV. And he represented Trump in one of these cases. Mm-hmm. And so the question in the media that we ask is this because Trump is not paying you? He doesn't answer that question. He says, well, I'll get into that another time. But there's a whole trail of lawyers who worked for Trump many of them as attack dogs who've turned against him.
Yeah.
It happens a lot.
Yeah, that's not a good sign.
Yeah, exactly. So, but the other thing I want to mention real quick is that Trump has benefited from a lot of these, what I call merchants of malice or provocateurs in our politics, he's adopted their approaches and their MOs and so on. Newt Gingrich, who was the Speaker of the House, and Trump almost made Gingrich his running mate, by the way. And Trump is still talking to Gingrich as an advisor. Gingrich was known as one of the most negative politicians we've ever had in Congress. He would give speeches to young Republicans before he made Speaker, and then when he got to be Speaker after the Republicans took control of the House, Republicans thought, well, he must know something because we won finally, and we took over the House. But his idea was always, when he talked to young Republicans, saying, I'm going to tell you something that someone should have told you a long time ago. When we talk to young people in the older generation in the Republican Party, we advise you to be obedient and civil and to listen to others. That's not what you should do. You should just attack the other side. Politics is war, and it's a war for power, and we have to understand that in our politics. That's what Gingrich is all about. We've had many politicians and many commentators, particularly in the Republican Party, who've taken that approach, and Trump has adopted that as well.
Do you have any position on the gerrymandering issue? This isn't something you covered in your book.
Yes.
But it seems to me both parties in the 70s, 80s, realized that by gerrymandering in an extreme way, they could make their seats safe, and that they would make deals. Okay, so there's 6 safe Republican seats and 12 safe Democrat seats, et cetera, in different states. But by making those seats safe for the party that was in power, it made it so that the primary was the important election, and that led to more extremism, because in a primary election that argument has been made plenty of times, and an interesting analysis. Do you think that set us up for, it doesn't cause it doesn't cause the toxic politics,
right,
but it seems to make it, nurture it, give it a nice place to live?
It does. Well, I think a couple of points. One is that the states that do most of the gerrymandering are controlled dominantly by one party or the other. It happens in a lot of Republican states in the South, California, New York, which are Democratic-controlled states. In this coming election, this election is almost certainly going to be decided in 6 states. In Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Nevada, Georgia, and well, there's one more. Pennsylvania, yeah. And those states the balance of power is very precarious for both sides. So the gerrymandering at this point is done in states where the parties have the power to do it, which means it's really not a contested state. But it's still unfair because, and you're having in the courts, a lot of courts have become controlled by one party or another, and so they support the gerrymanders in some states they don't. And so there's a lot of court shopping in challenging these gerrymanders. But generally, to my surprise, because I thought the courts would be more independent in this, the gerrymanders work. They do stay. And so that cements one party in power, and it takes a long time to change that. It's based on census and so on, and so it's every 10 years. So it takes a long time to change it. Right now, many states are, the party in control has so cemented themselves in power that it's almost impossible for the other party to do anything. And that's a real problem.
I always thought, you got to take this out of the hands of the politicians. You just make a law and say after the census, you hand the problem to a computer and say, draw the shortest number of lines, the shortest lines that divide it up in the equalest amounts, and doesn't make any difference if it goes through someone's backyard because they draw it that way anyway.
Right, exactly, exactly. Yeah.
It's something like that.
Yes, I've heard that solution raised, by the way.
Yeah,
the computer solution.
Yeah.
Nobody's bought into it.
No, there's not a single politician that will do that.
Right,
no.
Right, that's right. Exactly.
As you said, they're going for power, and this is taking it away from.
Right.
All right. So let's talk about we can go back and talk about the lousy things that happened a couple hundred years ago, but let's talk about what's really influenced our life and this current situation. And before we do that, one last thing. So now Donald Trump has just been convicted of 34 felonies. And they're not serious felonies from most people's point of view. I mean, I worked in New York. I think a lot of people would say, there's a lot of people that could be convicted of that kind of fraudulent behavior in New York. And so instead of saying, yes, I did that, but I was only brought to trial because people don't like me. No, he said the whole thing is rigged and I'm trying to, but I didn't do anything. So he didn't even take the sort of reasonable way out. But he did raise $70 million immediately afterwards. So what do you think has moved us from Ronald Reagan, where it almost was impossible to get him elected because he'd been divorced once, 30 years earlier, to this stage where a convicted felon doesn't seem to have any problem?
A little different atmosphere, isn't it? A completely different atmosphere. Well, remember Trump said 5 years ago, I could shoot somebody in the middle of Fifth Avenue in New York and I wouldn't lose a supporter. That was more true than we dreamed in the media, because all the things he's under attack in the courts, everything is rigged. But what he's doing is he's cleverly, in his own way, and partly because he's such a showman. He is a terrific showman. He understands how to entertain people. Frankly, that's what it is a lot of times. He can hold people in audiences for 2 hours in speeches and so on. No other politician can do that. And now these are, people talk about being a cult. In some ways it is. But I think part of it is that the other side, the Democrats, have let a large segment of the country go. They haven't paid attention to the working class, the white working class, even the black working class, Latinos, and Trump benefited from this. He's trying to be president of the aggrieved and the angry and the fearful and the resentful. And he has probably 40% of the country. Biden probably has less than that. That could all change in the next 5 months. But we can't minimize this idea of how effective Trump is in keeping his own people with him. These people must be so aggrieved and so angry. And just in my own case, I come from a working class family. My father was a longshoreman for a long time in New York City, and my mother was a waitress, and I have 4 brothers, and we had difficult times and all. And my working class parents would never have given Donald Trump a second thought, ever. It was always, those rich people don't care about us. Well, it's all changed now. And he has persuaded a sizable portion of the country that only he cares about them and will listen to them. And if you look anecdotally, if you look in polling, these folks will just dismiss every sign on the other side of that, every bit of information. They just don't believe, for instance, his track record of discriminating against black people in his housing projects, or when his companies would go bankrupt or have financial difficulty. The first people fired were the working class people, the chauffeurs and the waiters and the drivers and all the rest of it. But his people will not believe any of that is true, and there's no changing their minds. I've seen people try to do it in focus groups and in other ways, and it doesn't happen. So this is the electorate we have now. This is the demographics we have now. That's not to say that Biden can't win, because he can win, but it's going to be those 6 states, and that's a tough thing for Biden. Probably his best avenue is through Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. It's going to be very tough in Georgia and Nevada in particular for him this time. But anyway, as far as Trump goes, he's just so he's such a showman. But we've had this before. In some ways, Franklin Roosevelt was a showman. He was I remember him saying at one point, when Orson Welles, the famous actor who was, any of you know about old movies, know about Orson Welles, and did the War of the Worlds broadcast, where the people believed the Martians were really invading when he did a show on radio. And Roosevelt had Orson Welles over to the White House, and he said, what people don't realize is how much of this job that I'm in is an entertainment to hold people's interest. And he said, there are two great actors in America, the two greatest actors in America, and you're one of them, he said, and I'm the other. And he was right. But now Franklin Roosevelt's that pattern, he set so many patterns for us in politics. He rejected the toxicity, by the way. He was treated very badly by a lot of opposition leaders. His wife, Eleanor, in particular, was savaged by critics who felt she was going too far. She was going too far as a first lady. She was taking positions on politics, on issues, on support for civil rights and various other things, anti-poverty programs and so on. And she never responded. And Franklin Roosevelt said, people know me well enough and they know Eleanor well enough that they're not going to believe a lot of this stuff. And he was actually right. But it's very hard for politicians to resist fighting back these days on the same terms in which they're attacked, and that's another problem we have. Biden has tried to do that. He's tried to be civil. He's tried to not respond. He remember when he first took office, he said, not everything has to be a war. Not everything has to be something that we rip each other up over, rejecting that Gingrich philosophy that I talked about earlier. But he's been edging back into that again now. And I think his people want him to be much tougher. And I think a lot of Democrats want him to be much tougher. Now, how far does he go before he falls into the same pit that the toxic politics fall into? That's a big question he has to still answer.
Well, you mentioned in the book, it's really quite interesting that for example, Dewey and his vice presidential candidate, they both wanted to stay above the fray from Truman, and it helped Truman win. And you do say in several places that this toxic politics approach is effective.
Yes.
It works. And
Yes.
you mentioned, it appeals to the aggrieved, et cetera, and the fearful. And do you think that aggrieved and fearful portion of our population has increased, say, as a result of 9/11?
Yeah. The aggrieved portion?
The fearful.
The fearful, oh yeah, I think it has. I think there's a lot of people who are fearful for a lot of reasons. It's not just people who are afraid of a terrorist attack, and there's a lot of that. People are afraid of crime in the streets. That's back again as an issue. People are afraid of having their position in society taken away from them, particularly this working class white folks who I talk about in the book a lot. They're afraid that nobody listens to them anymore. Nobody cares about them anymore. And Trump understood this. He does address them. You look at his rallies, that's who are in the rallies. It's white working class people. And so he's got that audience and he knows exactly how to appeal to them. But a lot of it is they're afraid.
Well, let's do one of the histories of people who are the architects, the architects who created the drive, talked other people into using it, and we'll talk about Donald Trump's architect, Roy Cohn.
Well,
because he seemed to influence a lot of people, and some of them are still active.
Yes, we've talked about Roy Cohn before, and a lot of, as I mentioned, Gingrich is still an active advisor to Donald Trump. Roger Stone, who was one of Richard Nixon's henchmen, really, is an advisor to Donald Trump. There's a lot of these people. But Roy Cohn was very, very influential in Donald Trump's life. When he was coming up as a real estate guy, he was having problems with the courts, with law enforcement, with how he was treating people and so on. And Roy Cohn was Joe McCarthy, the communist hunter, his lawyer. And he was a very tough customer. And he was in trouble with the law himself. And he was a lawyer. And Trump, he got to know Cohn, and he adopted a lot of what Cohn said were the principles of success in business and politics, which is back to this attack. Never admit mistakes. If someone hits you, you hit them back 10 times harder. And that's exactly what Trump says he's doing. He talks about that. But Roy Cohn was a lot of people who knew him and knew of him felt he was a very reprehensible person. I don't know what your view of him was, because you've written about him, but Trump felt that he was very valuable in shaping Trump's public persona as the tough guy, the guy who, and which was Richard Nixon tried to do as well, the guy who never backs down. And he's still in that persona now.
Well, the point that I made about Roy Cohn is, I think in his first year, Donald Trump as president, he had a chief legal counsel named McGahn, I think, Don McGahn.
Yes.
Right? And it's public knowledge that he told Don McGahn, why do you take notes at meetings? You know, only bad lawyers take notes at meetings. You should be a great lawyer like Roy Cohn. This is your role model. That's who I want you to be. And it just struck me as that's an impeachable offense all by itself. Just to say that Roy Cohn is your role model as a lawyer, because that shows that you have no respect for the law or the rule of law. And as president, you're supposed to have respect for the rule of law. That's what you've said you're going to do. I think it doesn't. We don't need any of the other crimes.
Yeah.
We have something that's not a crime, but really should disqualify you as president.
Well, I mean, in the context of this toxic politics theme that we're talking about, and if you look at what Trump is saying, a lot of Democrats say, we need to believe him. Mm-hmm. He's talking about martial law on day one. Mm-hmm. He's serious about that. Now, does that mean he's going to throw people like me in jail? Journalists who have been critical of him? He's going to shut down media and newspapers? He certainly will deport hundreds of thousands of people or throw them into camps and probably have a ban on Muslim immigration into the United States. But a lot of that doesn't get covered because there's such a fire hydrant flow of information about him all the time. And we in the media, partly because of our economics in our business, we don't have the staffs anymore to keep on this stuff. I wish we did, but we don't. Look at the coverage of the trials. Those trials, the worst of it, we thought, were the trials about stealing the election in Georgia and the federal case. Mm-hmm. We don't hear anything about them anymore because he's delayed everything. But all his things he's talking about in other contexts would be thought of as unconstitutional. But it lasts for a day and then people move on. We have a very short attention span in the media and in the public. And if he is elected, and he could be elected, those first days are going to be very difficult for a lot of people to handle.
Mm-hmm. So let's go back into history and so that we don't feel all alone here.
Yes.
So Abraham Lincoln, generally regarded as the best president that we've ever had, with only a few people voting for Washington instead, but he comes in second most of the time. But he wasn't liked, and he was vilified, et cetera, et cetera. So why don't you talk about that period of time? Obviously, it was a very stringent time, and the people who hated him, you can expect them to be mad. They created a civil war after he got elected, but still.
Well, that was our worst toxic environment. Of course, we did have a civil war. We lost hundreds of thousands of people on both sides, the Confederacy and the Union side. But Lincoln he's eulogized now as sort of a secular martyr, because of course he was assassinated, partly because of the toxic environment. But that's after he actually won a second term. But some of the things that were said about him, he was talked about as a guerrilla. A lot of it was on his appearance. A lot of it, he was a power-hungry guy. He was a royalist. He was going to and he did take a lot of power, but a lot of people think during the war that's what he had to do. But he used self-deprecation. This is something I always wonder why politicians have lost that art of self-deprecation and humor. Lots of times he would give a speech, and particularly when he was coming up in politics and running for president, which he finally won, he was accused of being two-faced. And he would say, if I was two-faced, do you think I'd pick this one to use in the campaign? So it's very, very clever. And but he was assassinated. So lots of times we have this sense, how far does this go? Well, it does go far. I mean, a lot of the toxic atmosphere does lead to violence. We had We've had presidents assassinated. We've had Garfield. We've had McKinley. We've had Kennedy. We've had many assassination attempts. That's a whole book in itself, by the way. How many of our presidents have had, it's about 25, 30% of presidents have been killed in office or attempted assassinations. It's quite a large number. But Lincoln did not respond in kind a lot to the attacks against him. He used humor, and I think a lot of our politicians need to understand that today. The other thing I like to mention is 1968. This is, I talk about this as a separate lecture in a number of ways and in my classes. Those of you of a certain age, and I think there are some of you out there.
There's certainly some up here.
Yeah, and up here. Lived through that. To me, that was one of the most toxic periods in our whole history, except for the Civil War. I think it was probably the most toxic period. Because remember what happened in 1968. People were at each other's throats. We started the year, President Johnson, saying, there's light at the end of the tunnel in Vietnam. We're about to win the war. Then the Tet Offensive hit. That was attacks by the communist forces all over Vietnam, took the Americans and our South Vietnamese allies by surprise. A terrible mortification for Lyndon Johnson, who was saying we're about to win. That showed, even though the Americans largely won all those battles, it showed the war was nowhere near being over, and we were going to lose a lot more soldiers. We were going to a lot more civilians were going to be killed. It's going to cost a lot more money. So Johnson's reputation for credibility was shattered. Time goes on. There's Senator Eugene McCarthy runs for president as an anti-war candidate. He almost beats Johnson in New Hampshire primary. Bobby Kennedy, the original Bobby Kennedy, gets into the race. Johnson announces in March he's not running again. I can still remember that night. He's not running again, because then everybody thought, well, now we're in total chaos, and we were. Time goes on. Martin Luther King is killed. Riots in 100 cities, race riots. Bobby Kennedy is killed 6 weeks later. And a lot of us remember that thinking, what's happened? What's next? I mean, are we killing our best people? And people were just, there's the generation gap, the youth gap, the rise of very militant racial types of people around the country. It goes on and on. The Democratic Convention is plagued by riots. You might remember the scenes on the floor of the convention and in the streets of Chicago. Where's the Democratic Convention this year?
Chicago.
It's in Chicago.
Weren't they thinking when they did that? I was thinking the same thing, you know.
And then just to go on with this, remember the Olympics? It was shocked the Americans with the two American sprinters had the Black Power salute on the podium when they won their medals. And people thought, well, what's happening? This is supposed to be a patriotic celebration. These guys are giving the Black Power salute. And then we end up at the end of the year with the two candidates that the people wanted least. The two most establishment candidates. Hubert Humphrey for the Democrats, Richard Nixon for the Republicans. Nixon wins narrowly. Now we're at the position, we have the two candidates that people want least. Biden and Trump. Exactly the same dynamic.
Except for they're 20 years older.
Yeah. Well, they're 20 years older, right, exactly. And that's a whole other issue here. But anyway. So I always use 68 as an example of, we think it's bad today, and it's bad today in large part, because of social media. But in 68, it was awful for those of us who lived through that in many ways. And I always see it as a near nervous breakdown. And I hope we're not headed that way this time. We did have two terrible assassinations that year. So,
yeah. Well, for a little bit more lightness in the toxicity, yes. How about the Cleveland, the rhyme that was used against Grover Cleveland?
Yes. Well, Grover Cleveland was our only president who was elected, defeated, and came back again. So he sort of counts twice in our list of presidents as presidencies. But the first time he ran, which he won, his opponents found out that as a young man, he had been sort of getting around, as they say. And he had an affair with a young single woman, and she had a baby. And she said, the media found the story, said that he was the father, Grover Cleveland was the father. So then the opponents of Cleveland used this as an issue to challenge his character, because he was supposed to be the reformer, the guy with clean hands who's going to take over the government. So they came up with their rallies, and the little kid's name was Oscar Halpin Cleveland. He didn't have that name there. And his opponents at rallies would say, "Ma, ma, where's my pa? Ma, ma," that was the chant. Cleveland wins, and then his advisors start to chant at their rallies, "Ma, ma, where's my pa? Gone to the White House. Ha, ha, ha." So there was some humor there, too. But he did win. But the other interesting thing is, we talk about the character issue a lot. When Cleveland was president, he got married in the White House. He had never married until that time. And that was another sort of salacious part of our presidential history, because the media at the time, the paparazzi of the time, realized that Cleveland was marrying a woman who was like 30 years younger than him, Frances Folsom Cleveland. And she was like a Jackie Kennedy forerunner. She was very elegant, very smart, people just wanted to see her and know more about her. And it turned out that Cleveland, she was his law partner's daughter, and he babysat her when she was a little kid. And then he married her in the White House. So there was a lot of fodder then, too. For this.
I don't know why.
Yeah, right, exactly. How could that happen?
And the funny thing was, in that campaign, that the one, at least the first one, I think, was when he ran against Blaine, right?
Yes.
And Blaine was known for being totally corrupt and
Yes.
So he was the bad guy, and Cleveland was the good guy, in spite of this.
Yes, exactly. And that's part of why he won, because Blaine had a lot more public corruption,
right,
rather than this private moment that people weren't sure whether they were supposed to pay attention to. But it was hard to avoid.
Yeah. All right. So what about the Greeley scandal?
Oh, you mean the Horace Greeley?
Horace Greeley, yeah.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of this history we go into in the book, and I think that this is all related to Reconstruction and the Civil War and so on. But Greeley was an abolitionist. I don't know if this is what you're talking about, and he was sort of ahead of his time in that way. But it was not the kind of character issue that we were talking about just now. But we've had plenty of that too. But that period, people really didn't know how to deal with the South and the North and how to get along. We had a series of presidents who did not do us much good in correcting that before or after, except for Lincoln. Andrew Johnson, who was impeached, and so on. So that was a very difficult time for the country, and it was a very toxic time. This was one of those periods when toxicity was on the rise again. Yeah,
and the one election that seemed to be the most momentous was the 1876 one, Tilden and Hayes, where the whole electoral college thing became the crucial thing, and people have their degrees in history about how much corruption was involved in getting the Republican Hayes, the Republican Hayes back in there against the Democrat Tilden, who was the governor of New York.
Yes.
But the end result of it was the agreement to shut down the Reconstruction of the South, and all the African Americans that had been elected and everything. It all came to an end overnight, and et cetera, et cetera.
It did, yeah. And there's a lot of echoes of that today. If you look at a lot of the leadership in the Congress and a lot of where the most hardline politicians of the right are, it's the old Confederacy. Mm-hmm. And those folks have risen into safe seats in the House and Senate. And you look at the leadership, and a lot of the people who get the most attention, a lot of it is the old Confederacy. Now, Ohio is in that mix now, and there's some upper Middle West states too. But a lot of those folks will tell you privately that this is the South rising again. Mm-hmm. We've heard that phrase many times over the years.
Many times, yeah.
And it's happening.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about some of the non-politicians, because
Yes.
you go into that, and I think it's fascinating. And you had a great take on Rush Limbaugh, for example.
Yes.
And so why don't you talk about the commentators from the side and
Yes.
who's doing things right now?
Well, we've had this for a long time. You know, we tend to think a lot of what goes on in the current times is new, and a lot of it is not new. And that includes the commentators in the media. I mentioned Father Coughlin. Father Coughlin, Charles Coughlin, was a Roman Catholic priest from the upper Midwest. He was actually a Canadian, a very small parish, but he was a terrific speaker. He was a spellbinding orator, and he got a radio show, and it went national, and he had millions and millions of listeners. So he was really the first national radio commentator. Now we have them all over the place, but he was the first. He was very, very popular. And the interesting thing is, as I started to say before, he started out being a supporter of Roosevelt, but then he turned against Roosevelt because he felt that Roosevelt was not fighting the real enemy, which is what he called godless communism, that we were on the wrong side of World War II. We should be supporting the Nazis and the Japanese, and we should be fighting the Soviet Union. And in the end, his cardinal told him, you're getting too carried away with the radio show, and the cardinal didn't like the idea that he was taking on Roosevelt very vigorously. And he openly said, yeah, I'm now a fascist, because it's better than the alternative, which is communism, which he felt Roosevelt was going toward. In any case, the cardinal said to him, you got to give up the radio show. And he did. He gave up the radio show. He was not on again. And he said, disobedience is a grave sin, and I'm a priest, and I understand that, so he gave it all up. Now, how many of the commentators today would do anything like that? Nobody. But you look at that's sort of the progenitor of a lot of things we have today. The idea of speaking directly to the country, speaking to aggrieved groups and so on. And we see that the Rush Limbaugh is a direct descendant of that, a different politician. But Rush Limbaugh was another one of these guys like Trump, and Trump got a lot of what he's doing in this way from Limbaugh, a showman, an entertainer. And a lot of people ask me, well, why don't the Democrats do as well as these radio personalities do, or even the TV personalities? Because they're not as entertaining. It's actually pretty simple. If you listen to Limbaugh's remarks, some of it, it was appalling in some of the things he said, in my mind, but he was funny, and people would listen to him. He could hold the audience. He could hold the attention. And that's the same for a lot of the commentators today. I've known, so that's the radio, but there's a lot of other examples in radio and television now, partly because of Fox News. Tucker Carlson has now left Fox News, but you have Sean Hannity. Roger Ailes invented Fox News as the conservative broadcast network.
And you mentioned in your book that Roger Ailes also knew Roy Cohn, and that
he did,
and so that he was also influenced by him.
He was in that New York
to me that I didn't
lawyer right-wing axis there, and I knew Roger Ailes when he was rising as a political consultant. Again, it came from the entertainment industry. He had been the producer of the Mike Douglas show. I don't know if any of you remember this. This was a very popular daytime TV show, variety kind of a thing. And then he went into politics. He became George Bush, the father's media advisor. And that's where I got to know him very well. He became aware, this is before he went to Fox, he became aware that I come from a working class background, so we had this sort of a little common history there. And he was one of these guys who ingrained Bush with the idea that you're going to lose unless you get tougher. That's what a lot of these advisors tell the candidates these days. You're going to lose if you're going to get tougher. And there was one famous case where Bush was debating Michael Dukakis, the governor of Massachusetts. He wasn't doing so well in the first rounds. And then there was this big moment where he was about to debate Dukakis, and Roger Ailes makes a big point of rushing up to Bush, sitting in his chair, handing him a note. And Dukakis is sitting here. What's this all about? And Bush opens the note and looks at Rails and goes, and he had written on the note, "Kill." And Bush proceeded to dismantle Dukakis over one thing after another. But he needed that. But he let his advisors do the dirty work for him. Mm-hmm. Another famous person in politics who I actually knew very well was Lee Atwater. Lee Atwater was the guru of attack politics for Bush, and then became Republican National Chairman. And he was a very tough guy, but he was actually a very charming guy in person. He was funny and all of this, and he could be entertaining. And he cut his teeth on the idea of attacking. And he had a whole generation of Republican operatives who adopted his philosophy of the way you win an election is not with positive policies, but by tearing the other guy down and to show that he's worse than your guy. And that's what he did. And that's what Bush did against Dukakis.
And it works. Why do you think it works?
It's an easy way to look at campaigning. It's an easy way, and lots of times the critical ingredients in a campaign are a lot easier for people to understand, policy changes and policy nuances. Just to get the Democrats back in this picture again, Lyndon Johnson was very good at negative politics himself, and he was a Democrat. He sponsored and ran the most effective negative advertising, the most effective ad in television history, which is called the Daisy ad. The ad was a little, you might have seen this ad, it's very easy to find on YouTube and in other places. The history of television museums, it showed a little girl in a field picking the petals off a daisy. You know, like the "Who loves me not" type of thing. And then the sound comes up and she's getting the numbers wrong. 10, 4, 6, 6, and then a countdown of a nuclear test comes on, and the announcer counts down to 0, and then the camera focuses on her eye, and you see a nuclear mushroom cloud. So the idea is that she's going to be killed in a nuclear war. And that ran once, and it was so effective, it decimated Barry Goldwater's campaign in 1964. It only ran once, but the media picked it up. It never stopped running on the news shows. So after that, it was very clear that Goldwater was not going to go anywhere. The day after the ad ran, Johnson goes to the White House and talks to his staff, and really happy. Boy, that was a big success. And the advisor said, "It was so successful, we don't have to do it again." So Johnson says, "Why not one more time?" He said. But they didn't do it. They prevailed on him not to do it. So the Democrats have played the negative game too, in some ways.
Well, on the entertainment end of the toxic politics, it's a guy named Dick Tuck. I found very entertaining the things that he did. I had never heard of him or what he did. I love the Dump Nixon one.
Yes.
And et cetera. But why don't you tell a couple of the things he was just a kid in college, right?
Yeah, he was. Dick Tuck disliked Richard Nixon very early on, and so he started to work for Democrats in California to undermine Nixon.
So this is 1950s, right?
This is in the 50s.
Yeah.
Nixon gained fame running as an anti-communist, sort of a Joe McCarthy kind of a supporter, and he ran against a woman named Helen Gagan Douglas, who had been a movie star. And so he said in that campaign, a lot of people never forgave him for this, because he said that, the phrases were, if you're red, you're a communist; if you're pink, you're a communist sympathizer. And Nixon said, Helen Gagan Douglas is pink down to her underwear, he said. It's sort of clever. But anyway, it was very unfair to her, because she was actually a Franklin Roosevelt liberal. She wasn't a communist at all. But anyway, Dick Tuck took a dislike to Nixon for that kind of tactic. And for the rest of Nixon's career, Dick Tuck would show up in any campaign he could get into. If Nixon was involved, and he'd work for the other side. He just felt, I have to show Nixon show people what he's really like. And so he became known for dirty tricks. And a lot of them were clever. There was one case where he was at I think it was a dinner for Chinese people in California somewhere, and Dick Tuck ran a banner. It might have been streaming on a plane outside an outdoor rally in Chinese, and it was some insult of Nixon. And Nixon had no idea what it was. He thought it was a supporter. Looked up, and the people in the crowd who were Chinese American realized it was an insult, but he didn't understand it. So he got very upset with Dick Tuck. But Dick Tuck this all his career, and whenever there's a campaign against Nixon, after a while, Nixon got gun shy about it, and he said, a lot of people in my own administration, such as Donald Segretti, who was famous as a henchman of Nixon, he said he's doing all what Dick Tuck did all his life, but he just doesn't do it in his clever way. So I get blamed for it, and I don't even know who Donald Segretti is. I never even talked to the guy. But Dick Tuck became a sort of a symbol for dirty tricks done in a humorous way.
Yeah. He said, the ones that I remember from your book, he had a dump truck that came along, and on the side of it said "Dump Nixon,"
Yes.
to get him off the thing.
Yeah, exactly.
He in the Chinese one, he had all the Chinese fortune cookies
Yes.
that opened up and said something against Nixon.
Yeah.
So that,
Yeah.
I like those. And that he said, I think when he was a student at USC, he set up a lecture for Nixon, but then he didn't advertise it at all, so only 5 people showed up.
Right. He did, and
that kind of stuff. It was like,
right. Well, no, that's right. That was a famous example. He pretended to be a Nixon supporter, persuaded Nixon's people that he could organize this rally of students, didn't publicize it, and Nixon shows up in like a giant auditorium, and there's like 20 people. Who did this? Dick Tuck. So he never forgot the name.
Anyway, that's nice to hear that the architects of toxic politics occasionally have.
Exactly.
Yeah. There's a lot more detail in the book, of course. We haven't talked about so many of the current ones, like the people who were trying to get in.
Yes.
I'll have a question for you while we're doing this. So, what did you think about Tucker Carlson's interview of Putin?
I wouldn't have done it that way.
Did you think that helped him in his?
Yeah, but I think he made a mistake in leaving Fox. Frankly,
Yeah.
It's going to be hard for him to get that kind of a loyal audience base. It's possible he can do it, but I think he was becoming more successful than Sean Hannity, and that was driving Sean Hannity crazy. But now Sean Hannity really has that leader of the pack at Fox to himself. But Tucker Carlson I think he's going to have a difficult time finding a regular following that's easy to find him on. Mm-hmm. Which Fox was very easy. Mm-hmm. I knew him when he was in his bow tie period, as we call it, because he used to wear bow ties. And he was a very down-to-earth guy. He was a very nice guy. I traveled with him in the White House press corps. He wasn't in the press corps, but he traveled with us sometimes. I was on his show on TV a number of times, but then it all changed. The background of Tucker Carlson, he comes from a wealthy family, establishment Republican family, and he was trying to find a way to succeed in television, and he was experimenting as sort of an establishment Republican. He wasn't getting the fame he wanted, and then he decided, I'm just going to be a Trump Republican. He just decided that he was going to sign up for that bandwagon, and he's not gotten off it. Mm-hmm. He is a very reliable thing. By the way, there's in the Washington rumor mill, we're talking about a lot of possible running mates for Donald Trump. Tucker Carlson's name is now being added to the list.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. We have questions, yeah.
Yes, you've done a marvelous job in talking about toxic talk, but I'm increasingly concerned with what Jane Mayer talks about, the right-wing think tanks that are now becoming much more sophisticated at targeting what appears to be standard American values, and they've seeded think tanks all around the country, including universities. And in some sense, then Trump and toxic talk is just a distraction from this much deeper, much more widespread, much more sophisticated network. How do you see that?
That's a very good interpretation of it. I don't think that it's toxic politics is less important than this. I'll tell you why. Because a lot of what the think tanks are doing, toxic politics is an essential part of it. Like the Federalist Society that placed so many people on the Supreme Court and in our courts around the country, which I think is part of what you're referring to. Very effective in doing that. Supplying Trump and other people with ideas. And think tanks have done that for many, many years, from the Heritage Foundation and from other think tanks on the left, for instance, Brookings Institution, so on. But I think what's happening now is that there's the toxic politics and the toxic politicians, and that strategy fits perfectly with the approach of a lot of these think tanks to undermine central institutions in the United States. It used to be that it was easy to criticize Congress. Now, one institution after another has been undermined in its credibility. Congress, the presidency itself, law enforcement, which I didn't think I'd see, but law enforcement, the Justice Department, the health industry. Look at the hearings now with Dr. Fauci. That's an effort to undermine the scientific community over the COVID response. Now, I don't know what you think about the COVID response, but I got to know Fauci a little bit, and I don't think there's anything corrupt about him. I think he spent 40 years of his life doing something where he wasn't making the kind of money he could have made if he was outside of the government. So I think he's a rather public-spirited guy. But anyway, what I'm getting at is that one of our institutions after another is being undermined. My own career was in one of those institutions, in the media. We've been undermined. It goes on and on. The left undermines different institutions as well. Organized religion, the evangelical community, this sort of thing. So can we rally around as institutions, as Americans, that people will accept anymore? I don't know.
Baseball. Sorry.
Well, fans of
football would disagree.
Football would disagree. Anyway, but anyway, so I think it's a very troubling thing. But I see it as a combined flow of issues there, the toxic politics and the think tanks, because I think they're going in the same direction here. So.
Why do you think that there's this? A lot of people would take these attacks on our institutions as lining up for some kind of fascist dictatorship or something like that. But that doesn't seem to me that that's exactly what's going on. It seems much more just, we don't trust you, we don't trust you, we don't trust you, and the cumulative effect is to undercut the institution.
Right. Well, that's interesting because I've looked into this pretty carefully, and if you look at polling, it's now gotten to the point where it's not just our institutions, it's each other that we're undermining our confidence in. There's a wealth of polling now showing that most Americans not only don't trust each other, they don't want to be associated with each other. That supposed moderate middle is getting smaller and smaller. People are identifying themselves more as extreme liberals and extreme conservatives, and the moderates in the middle are getting smaller. That's where we thought the compromise would come in for many, many years. That was considered a bedrock idea of political theory for a long time. Some polls are very troubling. Not only do people think we're going in the wrong direction, that's been true for a very long time, by the way. So when the people start to say, people think we're in the wrong direction, people have felt that for decades and decades. Some people think we're not going in a conservative enough direction, not going in a liberal enough direction. It's not really a statement on which side is winning. It's that people are very worried about the future in a lot of different ways. But I think the whole idea of how we treat each other, that's what really bothers me about this, because I just in my due diligence looked up the latest polling, and something like 40% of Americans think we're going to have a civil war in their generation. We're going to have a fighting civil war. A lot of politicians openly say it's time for what some of the more conservative people say is a national divorce. They're talking about a civil war, where the red states secede, or the blue states secede, or they both secede, and who knows who's left. And you can imagine how horrible that would be. And so, if you look at what's happened before, when we've gotten to these really toxic periods, we have had violence. We have had assassinations. We did have a civil war. We had a riot, some people call it an insurrection, at the Capitol to stop the transfer of power to Biden. So some of this is already happening.
We don't have a lot of time left, but you do end your book on an upbeat note about what might be able to be done, and I don't want to end.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I've thought constantly about this. We're coming on the 250th anniversary of the founding of our country, and maybe that's the moment where we need to get sort of a renaissance of the idea that we need to focus more on what we agree on and what we don't agree on. Some people feel still that there's a lot more we agree on as Americans, and we should be more trusting of each other, and we should more focus on what we do agree on. And that runs into the reality of some people just won't feel that way. They'll just be hard-headed about everything. But, it's you get to the point where, you see, my daughter Jean and I went to a show last night in San Francisco of acrobats. I don't know, what was the name of it again, Jean?
Dear San Francisco.
Dear San Francisco. And the people were so respectful of each other, and they had such an affection for the city. And these are people who they had nothing to do with politics at all, but it was just nice to see, because it's a new show, and it's actually very interesting, fabulous acrobats. It sounds strange, it's almost like a circus type of thing, but it's really a wonderful show. But you just come away from it with the idea that people can get along. These people actually cared a lot about each other. Instead of having like nets when they do all these acrobatic things, they were like human nets underneath each other to catch them if they fell, literally. And it's just really nice to see. So maybe there is hope if there's some kind of a renaissance in the things we have in common, and maybe the 250th anniversary of our country is where this can cement itself in our minds. We like anniversaries, we like big events, and maybe we could use that to get to more of an understanding of a healing, or of a common ground that we can have. Some politicians are already talking about that, by the way. Some, particularly governors, are talking about, we in our state, we don't tear each other apart. They say it about Colorado and Connecticut, now they say it about Utah, various other places. So it is happening in some places. It needs a lot more work. That's sort of one moment I think could work to everybody's benefit.
And you mentioned in your book that both Presidents Eisenhower and JFK in a moderate middle sort of did that. So there's a question out here. Right?
Yes.
Yeah, so you talk about toxicity and that comes from political commentary. What about from the bias of everyday news reporting? Does that lead to toxicity?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't exempt my profession. I'm a mainstream journalist. I've been that all my life. I think we've gone astray in some ways. Part of it, this is a longer discussion, but basically the quick point is that one reason we've gone astray is we've gone away from the idea of journalism as an educational force and going more for quick hits and entertainment, conflict. We've always had that problem with being drawn to conflict. And a lot of people, by the way, are drawn to the media that covers conflict. So it's not, there's a good reason why the journalists have focused on conflict. When I was in journalism school, the old-time professors would say, if it bleeds, it leads. That was the old curmudgeon professors would say. A lot of truth in that, though. But one thing that's changed in the media in my lifetime is that the economics have changed in the mainstream media. It used to be that the whole enterprise would pay for the news division. In other words, you'd have the ads for department stores and paid obituaries and all this stuff. We put in a pot, and that would pay for everything. In other words, the news division doesn't have to pay for itself. Now the news division has to pay for itself. So that means what's going to bring in revenue? What's going to bring in readers, listeners, and viewers? Conflict, and that often means covering the toxic politics, covering the toxic world we're in. making fun of people, that sort of thing. People are drawn to that. They are. There's a lot of social science research about this, too, by the way. But I trace a lot of the problems in the mainstream media is to the economics changing. It used to be you could sort of use your best, more public-spirited instincts in what you covered and how you covered it. Now, people get fired if you're not meeting the marketers' margins of how much money you should be making in the news division and such. Mm-hmm. And as I say, that means generally covering conflict and clashes and people yelling at each other, crime, that sort of thing. And that explains a lot, I think, about what's going on in my own business.
So there's time for one more question. Is there another question out there?
I have a question about Robert F. Kennedy Jr., you know, the dark horse candidate and such, and the Camelot theory. So could you address that, please?
Sure.
Is he going to be a marginal force in the November election?
Well, I'm one to think that no. I'm one to think that I take the more of a traditional interpretation that the independent candidates, even those who seem very strong, tend to fade dramatically in the end when people feel that they're going to be throwing their vote away if they don't vote for the major party candidates who can win. Robert Kennedy Jr. does have a lot of support. Part of it is just simply his name from the storied Kennedy family. But when you look further into that, a lot of his own family members are opposed to him. They think that John F. Kennedy and his father, Robert Kennedy, would be appalled at some of the things he's saying today. And they probably would be. But he has the name. He has some positions that have captured people's attention. We still don't know, by the way, from polling at least, who he would draw more from. Would it be Trump or would it be Biden? Some polls say one, some polls say the other. So we really don't know. It could be he would hurt Trump more than Biden. It's unclear at this point. We have some examples like Ross Perot was a very strong candidate in another generation, and he only got 19% of the vote, but didn't get any electoral votes at all. And that was as close as the candidate has come in a long time.
Did he help Bill Clinton get elected with only 42% of the vote? That's the question. There's another theory about that he really hurt Clinton in some key states. Mm-hmm. And some people say he hurt Bush more nationally, but he hurt Clinton in key states. Mm-hmm. But he did depress both of their margins. Right. And that hurt Clinton when he was trying to govern as a minority president. Yeah. But at least what you're saying about how all the different groups and their reaction gives at least some idea about how we can move forward, which is to pay attention to everybody, to see that there's a large number of points of view, that we don't have to agree with each other on about 80% of the things that go on in our lives, and right. We can still get along as long as we agree about the 20%. Right. There's a 20% this thing. That's the way democracy's always worked, and it has, what we were discussing earlier too, it seems that after World War II, things had gotten so bad that a large number of people in responsible positions realized at a certain point you have to compromise so that things don't get even worse. Right. And that we've lost that, and if we get that back, we can go back to doing what democracy does all right. Right. Well, just I know we're winding up here, but we talked a little bit about Eisenhower and Kennedy, who were able to throttle the forces of polarization and demonization in the country. Eisenhower, of course, was a hero of World War II. Kennedy was not of the generation that ran the war. Eisenhower was. He was of the generation that fought the war. My father was in that generation and was a genuine hero. But though both of them were able to avoid getting dragged into the pit of toxicity themselves, they had people around them who could be tough. But it's nothing like it is today. And Eisenhower is very instructive because you had, after Truman was trying to deal with Joe McCarthy, the communist hunter, the senator from Wisconsin, he was very successful and very popular, but then he started to fade, and Eisenhower understood that he was wearing out his welcome, and he understood that Eisenhower was sort of astride the whole system.
People wanted a return to normalcy, as I think George is suggesting, and after Depression and World War. And they listened to Eisenhower, and Eisenhower wanted to have nothing to do with McCarthy. So he didn't attack him head on, just used a lighter touch, and he didn't call it McCarthyism, he called it McCarthy-wasism. And it worked. People said, well, I'm going to listen to President Eisenhower, not this senator who's always rattling the saber. And it worked for Eisenhower. Now, do we have a figure like that who could do that today? I don't see the person, but maybe there is. And that's what I'm hoping for in this 250th anniversary theory that I'm talking about. Maybe somebody will emerge that people will listen to.
Listen to Ken. Step forward. It's time. It's time. We all need you. Okay, thank you very much. And we'll see you again soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
As Donald Trump and Elon Musk continue to slash public spending, what impact will this have on the everyday citizens of the United States? And how will Trump's tariffs impact the country's global standing? This week on Upfront, I asked those questions to economist Richard Wolff. Richard Wolff, thanks so much for joining me on Upfront.
My pleasure.
So the Trump administration is set to cut $2 trillion in federal spending, slashing funding for disaster relief, humanitarian aid, the Center for Disease Control. I mean, just to name a few things. What do you make of this?
Well, on the one hand, this is the traditional Republican pitch. Remember, for at least a century, the Republican Party presents itself in this country as the party against taxes, the party for small government, all of that.
Yeah.
What you see in Mr. Trump is the same